A 2017 research study by the National Funeral Directors Association indicated that 62% of Americans believe that preparing for their end of life is important. So 62% of people surveyed said that preparing for end of life is important, but only 21% of people surveyed actually did it. So 62% say it's important, 21% actually do it. Now, there were a lot of reasons cited in the study for why that is. The one reason that was not cited, which to me seems like the reason that is probably the root of all the other reasons, is that we just don't like facing death. I mean, everything in our experience would tell us that we are not comfortable facing our own mortality. So the logical part of our brain knows that our lives are going to end, and so that same logical part of our brain tells us, we probably should prepare for that. But actually preparing for it forces you to kind of deal with it on a different level. It becomes a lot more real at that point. And we're just not comfortable with that sort of thing. We're in the season of Lent, and Lent really is in many ways a season that invites us to embrace our mortality. That's how Lent starts. Lent begins with Ash Wednesday. The significance of Ash Wednesday, ashes, is ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I mean, the season of Lent is an invitation for Christian people to embrace death. Not embrace it as oh good, we're all going to, but embrace it in the sense that it's a reality. And it's a specific reality in this specific sort of state that we live in. That death is and this is to use language that's in the Bible, it's a power, it's a principality. It's something that is characteristic of this kind of fallen world that we live in. And connected to death is all the stuff that causes death. Specifically, sin. So Lent is this season for us to really face, not avoid, but face head on our own mortality, the reality of death and all of the sin that causes death in the world. And it does that by asking us to focus on a very particular death. And that's the death of Jesus Christ. This morning, I'm going to share a story with you. How we anticipate, how we think about the death of Jesus, I think has huge implications for how we not just think about our own death, but think about all of the sin that causes death. Right? How we think about the death of Jesus Christ, how we anticipate it, because the characters in the New Testament are anticipating it, right? And then they sort of live through it. But Lent asks us to anticipate it, and how you do that has serious implications for how you think about and deal with the sin in your life, which in many ways is what Lent is all about. Here's a story. It's in John chapter 12. It goes this way. 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard. Just as a side note, does essence of nard sound like a perfume that any of you would want to wear? I'm sure it smelled beautiful. Maybe it's because the word nard sounds too much like lard. It's like when I hear it, I think, a jar full of pig fat? That's just, anyway, essence of nard. Okay, I'm sure it was beautiful. And she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You'll always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." We have 4 recordings of Jesus' life in our Christian New Testament. We call them Gospels. And they go by the names of the people that we assume or we believe authored them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This story, or a version of this story, is in all four Gospels. And that's pretty rare. You don't find in all four Gospels the same story or the pair. There's very few things that show up in all four. This story, or a version of this story, is one of them. And I say that because in all four accounts, the story is not the same. So in Matthew and Mark, for instance, this incident takes place in Bethany, just like in John. It's a couple miles outside Jerusalem. But it doesn't take place in the home of Lazarus. It takes place in the home of a man named Simon the leper. And the woman that John identifies as Mary in those two stories is not identified at all. We don't know who she is. Jesus doesn't identify her. Nobody in the story identifies her. In Luke's gospel, he has the story. It's not in Lazarus' house, and it's also not in Simon the leper's house. It's in the house of a religious leader. And the woman's not identified, so similar to Matthew and Mark. But in Luke, the story is used in a very different way. It's like a subtext for Jesus teaching the religious leader about forgiveness and mercy. So you have different accounts of the story. John places it in the home of Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. The principal character, the woman, is identified. She's Mary, that's Lazarus' sister. We know that Mary is very familiar with Jesus. They've had a number of different experiences together. So I tell you, I give you all that background. I tell you all that to say, it's very common in the Bible for storytellers to use stories to do theology. That's what they're doing. It's not uncommon. It's the same way storytellers do it today, right? So I'm of the opinion that this story, a woman pouring perfume on Jesus, happened probably one time in his life. I don't think this happened multiple times. It's sort of an odd thing to happen multiple times. I think it happened one time. And each of the gospel writers are using the story in different ways to communicate a different message. And so John, and these are the things, if you know the gospels well and you know that these stories show up in different ways, that's the stuff that you start paying attention to. Why does John place this story in Lazarus' home? Why does he identify the woman as Mary? Right, he's trying to tell you something. Right, these details are important. It's central to the story. Jesus is in Lazarus' home. Lazarus is a friend of his. He had previously raised him from the dead, and they're having dinner. It's on the front end of the Passover, the last Passover that Jesus will experience. He's in Bethany, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, so he's just outside the city. Next week, we're going to celebrate Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday that Jesus enters Jerusalem for the final time before his death and resurrection. So he's having dinner with loved one, with friends, in Lazarus' home. Martha is serving, and Mary, the other sister, takes this expensive jar of perfume, and she pours it on Jesus' feet, and she wipes his feet with her hair. Must have used a lot of the perfume. John says the fragrance filled the house. Now Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, he responds indignantly. You know, in his mind, this is a waste. You know, if we're just gonna take this very expensive perfume and dump it on Jesus' feet, wouldn't it be better if we sold it and like we could feed some hungry people with the money? Jesus' response, and let's be honest, I mean, let's give Judas his due for a minute, which John does not, right? John says Judas is a thief. He doesn't really care about the poor. He just, wants more money in the coffers because he helps himself to it, and, so if we, you get the idea. And so that may be true, but I think you all have probably been in that same scenario where you've had a similar thought. I mean, we have to do this as a leadership team all the time, right? Why would we take money and use it to buy such and such when there are hungry people? So, I mean, it's a legitimate thing, right? I mean, Jesus could easily have said, I understand what you're saying. So let's just not dismiss Judas entirely, right? But Jesus responds to Judas and says, leave her alone. What she's done is in preparation for my burial. So he identifies, or he interprets her act as having some connection to, something to do with his impending death, which at this point in the story is not a secret. Jesus talked about his death, his impending death, all the time. In John's gospel, So this story takes place in chapter 11 or chapter 12. So in John's gospel alone. Now, most of the references in John's gospel are veiled, so, we're going to take that into account, right? But in chapter 2, Jesus says to some religious leaders, if you destroy this temple 3 days later, I'll rebuild it. They thought he was referring to a building, but he was actually referring to his own body. In chapter 3, he says that he'll be lifted up, which is a reference to the cross. It's a reference to being hung on a cross. In chapter 6, he tells people to eat his body and drink his blood. In chapter 7, he tells his disciples that he won't be with them for much longer. Chapter 8, he gets into an altercation with some religious leaders, and he accuses them of trying to kill him. In chapter 10, he calls himself the Good Shepherd, who sacrifices his life for the sheep. So all of those references happen in John's gospel alone before you get to this incident in chapter 12. And if you add in all of the references in the other gospel stories at this sort of parallel point in the narrative, Jesus often told people, I am going to be betrayed into the hands of sinful men. I'm going to suffer many things. I am going to die, but 3 days later I'll rise from the dead. It was not something that he did not talk about. He talked about it all the time. So at this point in the story, the fact that Jesus is going to die should be a pretty well-established and accepted fact. But one of the interesting features of the gospel is the gospel accounts is that no matter how or how often he talked about it, it was like nobody in his immediate circle believed him or accepted it or acknowledged it. I mean, many of you are probably familiar with the famous incident with Peter. Jesus predicts his death, and Peter says, no, Jesus, how can you talk like that? This will never happen to you. To which Jesus calls him Satan. Right? I mean, he was so staunchly against this idea that Jesus would suffer and die that he rebukes Jesus for even talking about it. Now, one of the things we probably should appreciate is, much like our religious culture, they had a sacred text. They read their sacred text in a sort of a particular way. And based on their specific reading of their particular religious text, the thought of the Messiah dying, it was just not in their worldview. This is just not something that happens. In fact, later in this chapter, Jesus will predict his death again. And the crowd that he's speaking with gets all confused, and in verse 34, they say, we understand from the scripture that the Messiah will live forever. So how can he die? What are you talking about? So all of Jesus's, male disciples and his closest followers are probably just, look, this is just the world they live in. Right? Their religious understanding is that the Messiah is going to show up and is going to do some stuff and is going to live forever. So trying to get it into their brains that the Messiah is going to actually suffer and die is just a really hard thing, which is probably why Jesus talked about it all the time. Because he knew you're not going to understand this. You're not going to appreciate this. You're going to struggle to accept it. But how you think about what I'm doing here, especially as it relates to my death, is pretty central to what this whole thing is about. Nobody in his immediate, no matter how or how often he talked about it, it seemed like nobody kind of accepted it, except Mary. Mary, when she takes this expensive jar of perfume and she pours it on Jesus' feet, the story doesn't tell us that she knew what she was doing, but it does tell us that this is how Jesus interpreted it and how he talked about it. So let's assume for a minute that Mary knew what she was doing. This sort of taking an expensive perfume and pouring it on Jesus' feet in this way, it's like something that would have happened during an embalming process. I mean, Jesus interprets this as having to do with his death, which means that Mary, unlike everybody else, before it happens, is acknowledging and accepting that Jesus is going to die. And I assume, as a reader, that the reason that she does that is because he said he would. So maybe unlike everybody else in our stories, she's actually taking his words about his own death seriously. I'm taking a little interpretive license here, but many of you know the story that happens before this where Jesus is in the same house and he's sitting and he's talking with Mary, and Martha's busy, getting everything ready for dinner, and Mary's sitting and talking with Jesus, and Martha comes in and she's all upset because nobody's helping her and she's the only one working and she's always that way. And Jesus looks at her and says, Mary has discovered the only thing that is necessary, and it won't be taken away from her. I wonder, what were they talking about? Like, what was the subject of that little conversation? And I have to believe, or I like to believe, or for the purpose of this sermon, it's convenient to believe, that maybe at least part of the subject of that conversation was his death. That Mary has a captive audience with Jesus. And she's the only person in his whole sort of circle of friends who seems to acknowledge that this is actually going to happen. And that's a big deal because of how she does it. See, Mary's display is not an act of celebration. She's not full of joy. She's not grateful. Those emotions would not have made any sense at all. What she knows, or what she's accepting at this point, is that her friend, the person who raised her brother from the dead, the person who has performed countless miracles and showed compassion on countless people, the person she considers to be her rescuer, her savior, her Messiah, that this person is going to be betrayed and is going to suffer and is going to die. And she's willing to accept that because Jesus has said that's what's going to happen. But she's not doing it, she doesn't view it as primarily a good thing. This act of anointing him it's a somber one. This is not an act of celebration. This is an act of mourning. She views Jesus' death as primarily, not necessarily ultimately, but primarily a bad thing. You see, a lot of times in the contemporary church, that's not how we talk about Jesus' death. We talk about Jesus' death in many circles as being primarily a good thing. Or what do we call the day on which we remember Jesus' death? What do we name it? Good Friday. Now we do that, and the only reason we can do that is because we live on the other side of Easter Sunday. We know what happens 3 days later. But what you need to know is that becomes sort of like that, the knowledge of Easter becomes a bit of a double-edged sword. See, on the one hand, Easter is essential. Without Easter, this is just a murder. Jesus' death is just an execution. It means nothing to us. Easter, we need Easter in order to properly interpret what's going on Friday. In order to see Friday for what it actually is, which is the murder of God. But, just like any other story, when like something turns out good in the end, you have a tendency to overlook the atrocity that happened beforehand. So it's easy in Christian circles for us to talk about the death of Jesus because we already live on the other side of Easter, and we can say things like, oh, Jesus died for you. Isn't that such great news? Well, yes, but when we too quickly, prematurely maybe, when we too quickly jump to the cross as something to celebrate, something to be grateful for, we may overlook the very bad thing that's happening in Jesus' death. See, Mary sees Jesus' impending death as primarily a bad thing, the worst of things. Something that may, on some level, have to happen, or it's inevitable, or it's going to happen, or whatever, but it shouldn't happen. That this should not happen. That Jesus should never be betrayed by anybody. He should never be treated this way. That what happens on the cross is the result of human sin. Hers and theirs and ours, yours. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says that whenever we tell the story about Jesus' death and resurrection, that Mary would be remembered. And I don't think that he means that every single time we tell the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, like we have to tell the story of when she poured the perfume on his feet. I don't think that's what he means. I think what he means is whenever you tell the story, if you're telling it properly, that Mary's posture toward it will be reflected in the telling. It'll be baked into the cake. That when we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus, we have to talk about the death of Jesus as primarily a bad thing, the worst of things. Quite literally, the embodiment of all that is false and wrong. The cross is the incarnation. It is the taking on flesh of sin. Hers, theirs, ours. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that the cross is not ultimately a good thing. The cross is ultimately a good thing. And Jesus talked about it that way. In this chapter, he'll talk about it that way. Right? Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Jesus talked about his own death as being ultimately a good thing. But he also talked about it as being primarily a bad thing, which is an act of human betrayal and sin. Something that will happen or needs to happen. It's an inevitability, but it shouldn't happen. It should never happen. See, Mary gets that. Mary understands that. And sometimes in the church, we sort of blow past the moral depravity of the cross on our way to celebrating forgiveness and mercy, which we need to do. But Lent is our opportunity to face our sin, to take seriously all the stuff in our lives that do not belong, the stuff that creates just a wake of death and destruction everywhere we go, damages relationships, quite literally kills people. Killed him. See, if you don't view the cross properly, if you don't see what's happening on the cross the way that Mary sees it, you're not going to be as inclined to take your own sin as seriously as you ought to take it. That it was my sin that crucified Christ. And I live in the reality of God's grace and mercy toward me, but that grace and mercy is meaningless to me if I have not on some level grappled with the seriousness of my need for it. Lent is an invitation to you, to me, to face the stuff that's going on in our lives, the stuff that is disordered. All of the things that don't bring life, but they bring death to our family members, to our friends, to our coworkers, to our neighbors, to the, people on our kids' sports teams, right? All this stuff in us that doesn't belong. By anticipating the death of our God, a death that we're complicit in. that the stuff that's disordered in our life is not without consequence. Every sin is a little act of deicide. It's a little act of killing God. The death of Jesus on the cross is just the full embodiment of that. You take billions of human beings sinning over the course of human history, and you focus it onto one point in history, and what do you have? You have the cross. This is what we do to God every day. That's what human beings have been doing to God since the beginning of time. So the invitation is to, as we approach Good Friday, as we approach Easter Sunday, not to blow past, to just move through and view the cross as something to be celebrated, though it is, ultimately, but to primarily view the cross not as a good, bad thing, right? Like a good thing that, oh yeah, well yeah, some bad had to happen, but that's unfortunate, but all for the best. But reverse that and see the cross as a bad, good thing. So it's primarily a bad thing that ultimately turns out good. And we'll get to that. We'll get to Easter Sunday. But let's be in the reality of the death before that. Because without it, we may not take our own sin seriously. And listen, maybe you're a much better human being than I am. I need to take my sin seriously. I have to face it. I have to be honest about it. I have to confess it. I have to engage in practices in my life to try to put it away. It's important, because if I don't, and if you don't, you continue to participate, not in life, but in death. And it renders all of this, all of it, effectively a waste of time, if we see it wrongly and continue to participate in the wrong narrative. So a couple questions for you to think about as we wrap up this morning. I just want you to reflect on how you've understood the death of Christ. Have you thought about Jesus' death as primarily a good thing or a bad thing? And then just reflect on the implications of that. If you've primarily thought about Jesus' death as a good thing, are you prepared to acknowledge that that probably has an impact on how you think about your complicity in it, and maybe your willingness and your ability to deal with the sin in your life? Okay. We're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion, like we do every week. If you've never participated in communion with us before, you'll be dismissed in a minute from the back row by the ushers. Come forward. There'll be bread that you can take, and you can dip into a cup of juice. Communion is part of something you got to be careful about, right? That because we live on the other side of Easter, we know that the breaking of Jesus' body and the shedding of his blood is ultimately a good thing. It saves us from sin. But we can push right through it and not really grapple with the fact that Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, allowed himself to be murdered by sinful human beings, tortured and hung on a cross by people who were just living life, just doing their best, getting by, doing what they thought was right. And that's us every single day. We're just getting by, doing our best, just trying to get through life, doing what we think is right, and we don't realize that we're all upside down, and the stuff that we're doing is hurting and killing people. So when you come forward and you take the bread and the juice, enter into that. Remember that. This is part of our story. Ultimately, it turns out to be a good thing. But it can't be a good thing until we acknowledge what a bad thing it is. So when we take it in, we acknowledge that our God is a God who does this, and that's a good thing, and we're grateful for it, but it's also a terrible thing, something that should never have happened. And as much as it's up to us as we leave this space, that's not a life that we're going to participate in anymore. That we are going to be different people. We are not going to live that way. We're going to be a different people in the world.